I can't explain what I witnessed. I can't rationalize the bizarre sounds I heard. I can't reenact the conviction I heard in that man's voice. But I was there, and it was real. And that is what I have put my faith into. I died for the first time on the 18th of August, 2006. It wasn't a particularly pleasant death, nor was it one that I expected. It was simply the random act of violence that destroyed my life, and it came out of nowhere. We were just relaxing at the pub, enjoying a few drinks after a busy day at work. It was my turn to buy a round of drinks, so I was trying to get the attention of the bartender. I felt someone punch me in the side. At first, I thought someone had just hit me, but then I felt the warmth and the rapid stream of blood pouring down my shirt. I realized then and there that I'd actually gotten stabbed. As far as I can remember, it wasn't even that painful. Still, my legs gave out under me and I collapsed to the floor. Even then, I worried about ruining my expensive suit, ignoring the fact that I might be dying. Oncoming death is funny like that. Everyone thinks they're the exception, that they'll get out from whatever horrible situation the universe has thrust upon them. At least, that's what I thought, as the life drained from my body. The world around me just faded to black, and before I knew it, I had just died. Then there was the void. At first, it was little more than darkness, only broken by weird shapes and colors in the distance. As I regained a sense of my surroundings, I was dragged toward a new world, one without pain, suffering, nor death. All there was were people on a journey to different destinations. Whether they had all died like myself, or if they weren't born yet, I didn't know. All I knew was that I wasn't afraid anymore. The worries, the anxiety, and all my fears had been left behind. A light appeared in the distance, endlessly far away. I knew that would be my final destination, my final purpose in the brief life I'd led. Unfortunately, I never managed to get that far. I was jolted awake in my own bed, soaking wet from sweat and shaking like a maniac. My hand reflexively clutched my side to cover up the wound I'd sustained, but it wasn't there anymore. In fact, I didn't have a single scratch on me. Had it all been a dream? My phone lit up on the bedside table. I picked it up to find dozens of text messages and missed calls.
Hey man, we're at the pub. You coming or what?
The first message read, sent at 9:43 p.m.
Hey Rick, where the hell are you?
The second message said, sent at 10:23 p.m. Then there were a couple of phone calls and another message.
I guess you fell asleep, or maybe you're getting lucky. Whatever, I'll buy another shot in your honor. Happy birthday, Rick.
Then I had over 20 phone calls and a singular message that sent shivers down my spine.
For fuck's sake, pick up the damn phone. Something happened to Danny.
I immediately called back. My fingers were trembling from both anticipation and from the memory of what had happened only a night ago. Even if my death had been little more than a nightmare, I knew for sure I'd met up with my friends at the pub. The phone rang 3 times, then Jake picked up.
Rick, is that you? Where the hell are you?
Jake asked in a panicked, tired voice. I don't know what happened. I guess I fell asleep? I half asked, half stated.
Danny got stabbed last night,
Jake said without listening to my explanation. Stabbed? How?
I don't know. Some nutjob just walked up to him and stabbed him in the side.
I almost dropped my phone in shock. Danny had been attacked just like myself, in the exact same place. 1,000 thoughts rushed through my mind, but worry quickly became my main concern. Is he all right?
He's still in surgery. They're only letting his wife know about Oh, wait, here she comes.
Jake put his phone down, but I could still hear the muffled sound of their discussion. Danny's wife seemed upset, but I couldn't make out the words. "Jake?" I asked.
He's dead. Danny's dead.
The next few moments turned into a blurry haze of information. We'd all known Danny since we were kids, and now he was just gone. The murderer never even made it out from the pub. Apparently he got shot by one of the patrons as he tried to attack another guest. Still, I just couldn't shake the feeling that I was supposed to die that night. Regardless of what happened, time marched on without answers. Some of our coworkers quit after Danny's death, trying to hopelessly move on. I didn't blame them. I also needed some distance. I never even told them what I'd experienced that night. It wouldn't have helped them anyway. A year passed and I hardly spoke to any of my friends. I started to get some semblance of normalcy in the wake of Danny's death, but that would all come to an end on the 18th of August, 2007. By the time day had given way to night, I'd almost finished the bottle. Even as a rather large guy, the alcohol had hit me hard. At around 9 o'clock, I just passed out in bed, awaiting a horrible hangover in the morning. I only awoke around midnight when I heard the front door forcefully break open, followed by footsteps and whispers. I tried to get up, still drowsy from alcohol. As I took one step out from my bed, I slipped and came tumbling down to the floor. I produced a massive crash, loud enough to alert whichever intruders had broken in.
"I thought you said no one would be home,"
a man stated angrily.
"Don't worry about it. I'll go deal with it."
The footsteps moved quickly in my direction. I tried to lock the door, but they were too fast, kicking it open and knocking me back to the ground. A masked man entered my room, holding onto a gun. He only spoke a single sentence to me before pointing the weapon at me and pulling the trigger.
"You should have stayed quiet."
Unfortunately, the man had a horrible shot. He aimed at my head, but it hit me in the throat instead. There I lay, drowning in my own blood as I desperately gasped for air. I couldn't crawl away, and I couldn't call for help. I died on my bedroom floor, on my own birthday, just as I had a year earlier. Once life finally drained from my body and the god-awful pain ceased, I was back in the world beyond. I walked through the same colorful dimension that lay just on the edge of life. I admired the shapes and colors as they passed. In the distance, I saw a tree with branches stretching endlessly far from its trunk. From each branch dangled a person, real but not existing in our world. I wanted to visit them, but that wasn't my destination, because just like before, I would wake up in my own bed, unharmed by the events from the previous night. My phone buzzed, and I was filled with an unfathomable dread. I still couldn't quite believe it, but I started to understand that someone would take my place in death.
"Hello?"
Rick, it's Dad. Your mother, she passed away last night.
A lump formed in my throat. I knew what was coming next, but I had to ask. How? What happened?
The police say it was a burglary gone wrong. I don't know. I was working late. I should have been there.
The discussion trailed off from there. My dad was distraught and could barely form coherent sentences. He blamed himself for not being there, but I knew the truth. It was my fault. During the next 2 months, he fell into deep depression. I couldn't blame him. He just lost the love of his life. I moved in with him just to help him pick up the pieces. He put on a strong face, trying his best to keep the ship afloat, but I could tell how close he was to just breaking down.
If only I'd been there.
"It wasn't your fault, Dad. Had you been there, you might be gone too."
You don't know that.
But I did know, because the burglars weren't ever supposed to visit my parents' house. They were supposed to kill me. I had to come clean. I had to let him know the truth, but how could I? Half a year passed, and the secret ate at me. After everything that had happened, I still didn't know how to explain it. Still, I decided it was time to share my curse.
"Dad, can we talk?"
Yeah, what's going on?
He asked with a worried expression on his face. He knew me well, and he could tell a heavy burden was weighing me down. I started by telling him about my first death, down to the smallest detail. Of course, it matched everything that the people had witnessed in the pub that night, even the location of the stab wound. I told him Danny had taken my place in death and that I felt guilty. Naturally, he was skeptical at first, but then I told him about my mother. I didn't spare him any details. I told him where I'd gotten shot, that the door had been broken down, and that there were 2 robbers. Every detail matched perfectly down to the letter.
I'm so sorry, Dad. It was my fault. I killed her.
He just sat there in silence, processing what I'd just told him.
It wasn't your fault.
I was confused. There wasn't a single ounce of anger in his words, only overwhelming empathy.
How can you say that? She didn't have to die.
He mulled over his next words carefully before speaking.
You didn't do anything wrong, Rick. You just went about your life, and these things happened to you. I don't know why you've been brought back, or even how, but you're not to blame for what is done to you.
So, you believe me?
I asked. He nodded and embraced me in a hug. Suddenly, I wasn't alone in the world anymore. Someone knew what was happening to me.
What if it happens again?
Then we'll get through it together.
He stood by these words, even as my next birthday rolled around. That death was more tame. I slipped in the shower and broke my neck. The last thought that went through my mind as I left the world for the 3rd time was, how cliché. Once again, I awoke in my bed. I called out for my dad, making sure he was still alive, horrified that he might have taken my place. I couldn't even breathe until he came rushing to my side, asking what had happened.
I broke my neck, but I'm fine, I think.
It took a while before I figured out who had taken my place that time. But once I heard that my boss had died, something broke inside of me. He was the kindest man I'd ever met. And just like myself, he'd slipped and broken his neck. That was the final straw. It wasn't some bizarre coincidence I could brush off, nor a premonition. I decided then and there that I couldn't live with the responsibility. I had to put a stop to it, even if it meant giving up my own life. I figured that if I took control over my own fate and killed myself outside my own birthday, maybe I could prevent more people from dying. First, I left behind a long letter to my father, explaining why I'd chosen to leave. I couldn't face him in person. I knew he'd just try to talk me out of it, but it was something I had to do. I couldn't allow any more people to die on my behalf. Alas, fate is a fickle bitch. No matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't end my own life. I tried hanging, but the rope broke. Then I tried to shoot myself, but the gun jammed. When that failed, I tried to drive my car into a tree, but somehow I survived that as well. Any attempt was met with failure. All I could do was wait for my next birthday and let someone die in my place. No matter how many times I tried, I couldn't die. I was a slave to destiny, and it was destroying me. In 2009, I was hit by a drunk driver, and my girlfriend took my place. In 2010, I drowned, and my kind neighbor had to go through that death. In 2011, I died from a brain aneurysm, which ended up killing my aunt. And so on and so on. Each year I'd die, and a person close to me would take my place. I kept trying to find a way out, but fate wouldn't have it. Years went by, and on the 18th of August 2019, I would die for the 14th time. I'd already fallen sick a week earlier, much to the doctor's confusion. According to each and every laboratory value, I was fine, yet I kept getting sicker. My father and I both knew my time was near, but we also knew I'd be forcefully brought back. Then, at midnight on my birthday, my heart just gave out. I was jolted awake in my own bed, and the sickness was little more than a distant memory.
Dad?
I called out. No response. I got out of bed and called his name again. I was met with silence. I didn't have to call a 3rd time. I already knew what had happened. I carefully walked into his room, horrified at what I knew would come. He was dead, just gone from a heart attack. He'd taken my place, and I could do nothing to save him. The funeral came and went in a blur. The only noticeable thing was the missing seats from the people who had passed before him. Some of them had lived their own lives and died as nature intended, but a number of them were supposed to live on. Instead, they'd just taken my place in death. I inherited a number of things from my father. Among them, I found a letter addressed to me. It looked rather worn, so I could tell he'd written it a long time ago.
Dear Richard, today is your birthday, and it has officially been a year since your mother passed. While I miss her greatly, I'm thankful to still have you around. I know that if she was given the choice, she would want you to live. I feel the same way. We both know that I might one day take your place in death. Never doubt that I would happily give my life if it means that you may live. You didn't choose this curse, so never blame yourself. Just do what every person is supposed to. Appreciate the people around you, because you never know what day might be their last. I love you, Dad.
Since I read that letter, I've been looking for a way out. My father might want to stay behind, but how can I live on, knowing that I'm taking someone's place? I've long since left town, living by myself in a cabin somewhere away from people. Hopefully, if I have no one left that cares about me, people will stop dying. At least until I can figure out not only how to die, but how to actually stay dead. I'm sorry. My old Toyota was barely hanging on during my trip to work that day. I probably should have asked around to maybe arrange a carpool, or even just called in sick, but I was hoping it wasn't too far gone. It was approaching the end of the month, and the last thing I needed was to miss a day of work when rent was coming due. Though the job paid pretty well, I still mostly lived paycheck to paycheck. I managed my money well enough, but things weren't always easy for the working man who never managed to achieve any further education after graduating high school. My home life hadn't been the most stable over the years, so I had never been the most attentive student. There were times I never even believed I would see the other side of those times with my sanity intact, but life got considerably easier when I was able to move out of my childhood home. My old beater of a car was struggling like hell when I pulled into the parking lot at my job. I kept my fingers crossed that it would still get me home after my 8-hour shift ended. I had been ignoring the check engine light for a while now, but it hadn't been struggling so much until this Thursday afternoon. I live a good 40 minutes away from my job. The money was decent enough to warrant the commute. Still, I shouldn't have continued to procrastinate in getting my car looked at. It was my lifeline after all. I suppose I was hoping to avoid the likely high cost of whatever repairs it would need, or having to take any time off work to arrange to get it fixed up. So, I just continued to cross my fingers and roll the dice. Naturally, of all days for this to happen, my relief called in a little after 10 to let me know he would be a few hours late. Caleb, a friend who works in another department, had already offered to give me a ride home if my car wouldn't crank, since he lives out my way. Unfortunately, Jackson running late guaranteed that my only option would be to put my faith in my ragged old Toyota to get home at 2 in the morning, when my now elongated shift would come to an end. I snuck out to the parking lot to check things out during my break times, but I wasn't the most well-versed in automotive problems. I looked up a few videos to narrow down what could be causing the engine to stall, smoke, and backfire from time to time, but most of my research indicated I would need a replacement part or two, to which I currently had no access to. I told myself that I would not procrastinate any longer on getting someone to look at it if I could just make it home safely that night. As was almost entirely too predictable, Jackson did not stroll in until a little after 3. Yeah, he apologized for the inconvenience, but it felt more of an obligatory statement than a genuine one. Maybe I was just pissy about having to work over, while frustrated about my uncertain trip home so late. Regardless of my irritation with the situation, I was finally ready to approach my near-death sedan and hope for the best. It didn't help my circumstances that it was the middle of November, and the 32-degree temperature and bitter wind were already biting into my skin by the time I reached my vehicle. Between the cold causing my gooseflesh to shiver and the uncertainty of whether or not my car would start, making my back tense up, I was far from a happy camper. My hand was shaking like hell while I attempted to slide my key into the ignition switch, but I finally made contact and gave it a turn. It took a few tries, forcing me to worry I would flood the engine, but before too long, my rust bucket was humming, to which I let out a grateful sigh in return. Hopeful that my journey back home would go smoothly, I took advantage of the deserted roads and pushed my pedal down to make the trip in my iffy vehicle as short as possible. If nothing else, pushing past the speed limit got me a little closer to my destination before the engine let out a loud popping sound, followed by a high-pitched squeal while steam billowed out from under the hood. I'd love to tell you that I handled it with dignity, but that was far from the case. As I guided my deceased piece of shit onto the side of the road, with a complete absence of power pushing the wheels, I yelled out every single variation of swear words that my brain could conjure. I popped the hood, which caused more steam to burst out into the frigid night air. I slipped on my work gloves to be able to flip the latch to release it all the way, but it was hard to see anything through the fog that was erupting from my engine. The cold weather only served to make it even thicker. After feeding the radiator some water, wiggling a couple of hoses, and kicking the shit out of my bumper, leaving a fresh new dent to add to my aggravated state, I gave my ignition another try. It wouldn't even attempt to turn over. I just sat in my driver's seat for a while, thumbing through my contacts in search of anyone who may be up this late, while puffing away on a freshly lit cigarette. I'd never tried Uber or any such services in the past, so I was unsure if they still operated at this hour. Naturally, my service was sketchy in the middle of nowhere that I now sat parked in my broken Toyota. No Wi-Fi, no mobile data, 1 bar of service. Yep, the fates were not in my corner on this bitter, cold night. With a heavy sigh that made my breath mimic the steam that still drifted out from under my now closed hood, I snatched my backpack from the passenger seat and began my long walk home. It was around 4 in the morning. I was still muttering curses under my breath over the first couple of miles of the trip. I had my hands buried in my jacket pockets, and I wished I'd thought to wear something thicker when I headed out to work some 12 hours ago. I stopped for a moment to light another cigarette while checking on my phone to see if my access to the internet had returned yet. Of course not, I said to myself with another sigh. My feet were already throbbing. I stretched my back out, causing a series of cracks and pops to echo from the lower half of my spine. I looked around at the empty road, feeling like it appeared far less familiar than the one I had traversed twice a day for the last few years. There were woods on either side of me, which I always knew to be there, but they still looked almost foreign to me. Perhaps they just seemed different because I stood in place, as opposed to the 60 miles per hour I would normally be speeding past them at. Maybe I just hadn't paid much attention to them before. It was still a strange sensation, to be honest. Everything felt a little off somehow. The air was cold, but the wind did not appear to be moving much. It didn't smell like frosty grass and leaves. Maybe it had just been some time since I last took the time to appreciate such scents. It was almost as if the oxygen I breathed tasted used in some way, if that makes any sort of sense. The world around me was almost completely silent, while I sat on the curb, taking a deep drag on my smoke while allowing my exhausted feet to stop throbbing for a moment or two. The trees on either side of the road appeared to harbor no life. No rustling, no crickets chirping, nothing. It could be that many forest creatures were hibernating or otherwise at rest. Again, something I never paid much attention to before. Rarely was I out this late, and this would be the first time I was forced to trudge a good 20 miles back to my home. Before I started moving again, I decided to dig through my bag to find my earbuds. Perhaps some music would make the time pass by at a quicker pace. I tapped shuffle on my downloaded songs and began walking. Maybe 45 minutes after my trip resumed, I decided to give my phone an obligatory glance to check the time. 4:30, I exclaimed to the deserted highway. I was sure I had been walking for at least an hour before I stopped the first time. There was no way I'd only been traveling for half that. I glanced around to see nothing more than trees and the empty road. There was nothing that could differentiate where I started from where I now stood, aside from the ragged rust bucket I'd left in the breakdown lane many miles back. Part of me almost wanted to travel back to where I had come from, but I didn't want this trip to take even longer. Surely my phone was just glitching from the cold. Maybe service was just so bad out here that I wasn't able to get a solid reading of the time. That made sense, I guess. It was a reasonable enough theory, anyway. Far more sensible logic than the last couple of hours of walking, only actually being a quarter of that time. Once again, I began my saunter with a freshly lit cigarette and some new music. The chilly air was still biting into my skin, and now my shoulders were so tensed up that I may have left the coat hanger in my jacket when I threw it on before leaving my job in the dust. Every few minutes, I glanced back at my phone to see the time remained unchanged. I kept going, regardless of the unmoving digits on my screen, assuming that this only proves my theory that it was nothing more than a technical issue. I continued to glare at the phone until another minute finally passed by on its face, which felt like it took a good quarter of an hour to my internal clock. After many more miles, and only a handful of minutes having supposedly passed by, I knew that the sun should have risen by this point. According to my mental chronometer, it should be creeping up on 7, though my phone insisted it was only a little after 5. I was sure that dawn had to be just around the corner, but I couldn't see the slightest indication that the sun would be rising any time soon. It did not surprise me to see my phone's low battery light flashing either. I was growing steadily more skeptical about the possibility of ever getting back to my home when the road finally showed me signs of life beyond my own. The world was so dark around me that the headlights approaching from my rear practically lit up the entire highway. I turned to face the vehicle that sped in my direction and extended my thumb out to the side. I could only hope this lone traveler would take pity on me. I may have been seeing things, but as the car drew closer, it looked as though it was bellowing almost as much steam as my own had been before it sputtered out. Still, I maintained my outstretched, pleading thumb and hoped to God they would pull over. As the long and wide 70s model Lincoln slowed down and drifted over the curb where I stood, I practically leapt for joy in the back of my mind. I stashed my phone and earbuds into my jacket pocket and jogged over to meet the veritable land yacht that appeared to shudder wildly as it idled, had a transparent tarp in place of the absent glass, and the faded green paint was chipped and speckled with splotches of rust, but I was still excited to have a ride nonetheless. "Thank you so much," I exclaimed after pulling the door open to allow a cloud of cigarette smoke to erupt from inside. As soon as I got the words out of my mouth, a foul smell leaked from within. It almost made me think of moldy bread dipped in spoiled milk. The seats were covered by large sweatshirts that appeared to represent one football team or another. They were a similar green to the exterior and had what almost looked to be numbers sewn into them in large white patches, stained with yellow and brown splotches. They were more like symbols than actual numbers, though. Perhaps the shirts represented a foreign team, bearing less recognizable numerology. The woman at the steering wheel didn't so much as glance in my direction when I slid into the vehicle and closed the door. She was incredibly thin, with heavily wrinkled and darkly tanned skin. It looked far from a natural tan. She appeared as though she had seen the wrong end of many hard drugs in her time. Her knotted hair had a faded purple dye job, dark roots with streams of gray and white running through it. She wore a faded blue and pink flowered dress that revealed her bony and weathered arms. As soon as I snapped the seatbelt latch, she hit the gas without a word. Though the interior of the car was quite massive, I had little legroom as my seat was pushed up close to the glove compartment. Choosing not to take a glance in my gift horse's mouth, I thought it was best to not push my luck by adjusting the seat. It was quite awkward to be sharing a car with someone who wouldn't so much as acknowledge me, but the fact we were moving considerably faster than the couple miles per hour I may have previously been going made it easy to tolerate a bit of discomfort. "I really can't thank you enough for picking me up," I offered in an attempt to ease the tension.
Ain't nothing.
She spoke in a graveled and worn voice. "What brings you out this way so late?" I asked, trying my hand at a bit of small talk.
Driving.
I just nodded my head while deciding it may be best to remain silent after all, as the woman to my left reached into the center console and pulled out a pack of Morley cigarettes. I had to double take at the writing across the wrinkled, soft-shell pack, as it was designed to match the style of Marlboros, which were my go-to brand. I recalled watching several movies over the years whose characters would smoke Morleys, as this would avoid the producers having to pay an actual cigarette company to allow their name to be displayed on film. Could this have been some sort of novelty pack? Was I reading way too much into a simple pack of smokes? Likely so. The woman held the open, crumpled box up to her mouth and pulled a cigarette out with her lips, tracking thick saliva across the other remaining butts in the pack. She offered me one with her outstretched hand while she lit the one in her mouth with the other, letting go of the steering wheel and causing the car to drift quickly to the left. No thanks," I replied to the splayed open pack in her hand, gripping my right hand tightly around the "oh shit" handle above the passenger door.
Suit yourself.
She stated, wrapping her bony fingers around the steering wheel again while taking an unnervingly long, deep drag from her cigarette. I tried to make my glaring eyes as inconspicuous as possible while I watched half of the lit cigarette between the old woman's dried and chapped lips burn about halfway down through that long single drag. The solid inch of cylindrical ash still protruded from the remaining cigarette that still hung out of her mouth, falling to her chest moments later. That was when I noticed the front of her dress was covered in gray, sooty ex-nicotine and paper. I had momentarily been tempted to fish out my own smokes after she offered me one of her spit-moistened ones, but I found my appetite for the habit waning. By the time the woman snuffed out her Morley in the cluttered ashtray before lighting another, it was getting harder and harder to see much of anything through the thick plume of smoke that filled the cabin of the old Lincoln. "Do you mind if I crack the window?" I asked, hoping this request would not offend my chauffeur.
Lever's broke.
She replied, taking another incredibly deep inhale of smoke. The more I heard her speak, though it had only been short replies at most, what I could make out from her accent sounded southern almost, but more like a parody of what some may assume a country accent should sound like, if that makes any sense. It reminded me of an actor putting on a southern drawl for a role, having never actually heard one in person. I continued, hoping I wasn't pushing my luck with the strange old bird.
Listen's broke too.
She said, jiggling the handle for confirmation. "Oh,"
You can get out if it's bothering you.
she stated with a shrug. In all honesty, I considered it. We had already been driving for a good 10 minutes or so. Surely I wasn't far off now. Still, the thought of getting back out into the freezing air versus just a little while longer of muffling my coughs and trying my best to avoid breathing in that awful smell would remain an inner debate for a while. "No, it's okay," I replied, still unsure if this was the right call. "I didn't mean any offense. I really do appreciate the ride." She shook her head from side to side while muttering under her breath. We sat in silence for some time while my driver chain-smoked one after the other. I could hardly breathe after another 10 minutes went by, but I knew we had to be getting closer to my destination. This road was a straight shot to the town I lived in, and my home was only a few minutes past the city limits. Though I couldn't see a damn thing through the smoke that engulfed the speeding car, I was certain I should be within tolerable walking distance of my house by this point. I was beyond ready to get away from the foul stench and breath and into some fresh air. Not to mention, everything felt just a little bit off, from the cigarette pack to the phony accent. Sure, I could be overreacting to easily explainable things, especially with how exhausted both my body and mind had gone, but I wanted nothing more than to get out of this car and away from this woman. "If it's cool, I think this should be close enough," I said, breaking the silence that was almost as suffocating as the thick fog. No reply. I can just get out right here if you don't mind pulling over." Still not a word. I sincerely can't thank you enough for getting me this far. Was she even still awake? Ma'am? Nothing. All I could see was the flicker of light when she would take another deep drag off her cigarette. All I could hear was the rumbling of the engine, the tarp flapping in the wind behind me, and the tire's occasional bump over the reflectors in the center line of the road. I waved my hand back and forth in an attempt to clear a line of sight through the cloud. Suddenly, the woman's face emerged through the smog as she let go of the steering wheel and charged toward me. Within a second, her whole body was on top of me in the passenger seat, and her wrinkled and bony fingers wrapped around my wrists, pinning me to the door.
You ain't going nowhere.
Her foul breath hit me like a careening truck. Apparently, that was the very thing that worked its way through the car, though that was only the diluted version. What struck my nose this time was much more intense and stomach-churning. I had to fight against the lump forming in my throat, as well as the considerable strength of the frail old woman.
You had your chance to leave. I didn't have to offer you that.
She said softly. I could feel the car gliding from left to right as we still sped across the deserted road. I had no idea how this was possible, as the foot that was previously on the pedal was now pushing against the dashboard as she continued to scream at my face.
I picked you up. That means I own your ass now. Them's the rules, boy.
Her eyes were wide and maniacal, as was her menacing grin, which was filled to the brim with yellowed and rotten teeth. "Get off me!" I squeaked out after her fingers let go of my wrists and wrapped around my throat. I grabbed onto the door latch with my now free hand and hoped to be able to throw it open. Surely rolling out onto the concrete couldn't be much worse than whatever this insane hag had in store for me. Of course, the door wouldn't give way. She cackled madly while I attempted to fumble around for the lock.
You ain't getting back out that door.
She sneered, digging